Hello everybody, we're going to continue our teaching series on foundations or the life of Peter. It's called Foundations. It's about the life of Peter. We've been looking through some of his examples and then some of the scriptures that he wrote, 1st and 2nd Peter in the New Testament. So we're going to get back to 1st Peter today, and to do that, I'm going to get there, I first want to talk a little bit about the tendency in humanity, and so to get there, let's talk a little bit about TV. It seems to me that there's a trend in TV to kind of exploit some negative human tendencies. Like, for instance, Survivor. I don't watch Survivor much, but I know that it was a situation that started where you put a bunch of people on an island and watch them all kind of turn on each other. Like, it exploited some of the negative traits in humans. Now, game shows have done this for years. My mom used to tell me about Let's Make a Deal, and how they would sometimes give someone a $100 bill, which is probably the equivalent to a $1,000 bill now. This was back in the 60s. And they would say, you can have that $100 bill or trade it for what's behind door number 2. And you never knew what was behind door number 2. It could be a car, it could be a turtle. But sometimes often people would give the $100 bill back for a chance at what they didn't have. So you had this great thing in front of you, but you gave it away for the chance. And she would tell me about that. Usually it was to teach me about something I was doing as a kid, where I would forget about something I had and only what it was usually that. I only wanted the things that I didn't have and would forget about what I had. But then a newer game show came along called Deal or No Deal, and I can't watch that anymore because I get so frustrated by the choices people make. And I'm not above it. I would probably make the same choices, but you watch people trade in enormous amounts of money for the chance at more. So you get this case. There's 20 cases. You pick a case, and you're entitled to whatever's in the case. It could be a penny all the way up to $1 million. There's 20 different denominations in each case. And you gradually open up cases, which gives you a little more insight to what could be in your case, but you never know till the end. All the while, the banker is trying to guess what's in your case based on what's in the cases on the stage, and he wants to make a deal with you, or she now wants to make a deal with you to get the case out of your hand so that you'll settle with something that hopefully, from her perspective, is better than what you would have taken home. And you're trying to decide, do I want to keep my case or I want to wait it out for more money? But anyway, you get these situations where there'll be this roofer from Minnesota that's offered $350,000 for their case, and their friends are like, you only have to open 2 more cases. Do it. Say no deal and open more cases and you'll get a better offer. And then they'll say no deal and open 2 more cases, and they'll inevitably open 2 huge numbers, and then the deal goes way down. And they had this incredible offer, but they traded it away because they thought they were missing an even greater opportunity. Now, Christmas season came, and there was a contestant named what was his name? His name was Lewis Green, and he was down to 2 cases left. There was his case and 1 case up on the stage. One of the cases had $750,000. The other had $5. His case could have been either one. He didn't know. So the banker offered him $333,000 to surrender his case. $333,000. And he said no deal because there was a 50% chance that his case had $750,000 in it. There's also a 50% chance that it had $5 in it. He turned down the deal, opened his case, and he got $5. He traded all that away for the potential. He forgot that what he had at that moment was $333,000. Anyway, this exploits that horrible human tendency we have to want what we don't have and think it could be better if we would just try and we go for immediate gratification over long term. We set it all aside. The Bible, this is a theme in the Bible. The Bible talks a lot about this tendency. In fact, the scriptures open. The opening story of the Bible is Adam and Eve. And they trade connection with God, paradise, for the bite of an apple that is forbidden. They trade it all for what's behind door number one, paradise with God. Or door number two, eat this apple and see what happens. And they eat the apple as if somehow life could get better than paradise with God. A few chapters later, we see the story of Jacob and Esau, where Jacob makes a bowl of soup or stew for Esau. Esau's hungry. He just came out from a long time of hunting. And the Bible says that Esau didn't care about his birthright. He traded that all away for some immediate gratification in food. And this is seen symbolically in Scripture as the dangerous tendency of humans to trade their identity even for door number two, for something that could be bigger or better. So that gets us into 1 Peter chapter 4, our text for today. And I want you to think about that human tendency that we all have that could be better. And we fail to think long term and trade in what we have that's great for the chance at something better that rarely is. So here's 1 Peter 4. He says, "Therefore, since Christ suffered in his body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude. Because whoever suffers in the body is done with sin. As a result, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what the pagans choose to do, living in debauchery, lust, drunkenness, orgies, carousing, detestable idolatry. They are surprised that you do not join them in their reckless, wild living, and they heap abuse on you. But they will have to give account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead." So it seems to me when I read this that Peter is touching on a problem that has plagued humans for thousands of years. It all has to do with what place we choose to live from. We either live with the moment in mind, or we live with the end in mind. We either live with the immediate and temporary in mind, or we live with the end in mind. The words we read point to the idea of giving an account to God one day. Peter says there are two very different approaches to life. We approach life with the end in mind, standing before God, or we approach life with today in mind, living for the possibilities of the moment and rejecting the potential long-term effects of our decisions. Door number one, connection with God. Door number two, the possibilities of momentary indulgence. And we will trade a lot. So what I want you to start thinking about today is, are you living for temporary things, or are you living for long-term eternal things that we can have in hand right now through Jesus? I also want you to notice that Peter seems to describe an intentional pull. He talks about a kind of pressure from society. They'll wonder why you haven't. They'll be mad at you for not. Like, there's this pull. And I think this pull comes in two places. First of all, it comes from people who want you to live like them, right? We all want people to, they say, don't drink. Nobody wants to drink alone. You want people to do the kinds of things you're doing. So there's that peer pressure pool of other people who maybe are far from God that want you to join them in their kind of lifestyle. But then there's also marketing. There is more money to be made when people think about what we need now that we don't have than people who are content and live for long-term spiritual things, right? And so there's marketing constantly telling you, you need this, you should do this, your life would be better if you had this. Everything's trying to say what you have right now in door number one isn't good enough. You need door number 2 to be happy. So we have those pulls from our culture around us away from happiness and contentment and fulfillment and friendship with God, as in they're trying to make us feel like we need other things that we don't have. So it makes this very difficult. Okay, so let's break this down a little bit and get uncomfortable. Just remember that I'm in this with you. I want you, and we're going to think about the things that we live for, the things that we pursue, the things that we run after, the things that we stress over, the things we stress most over, and whether or not they represent a concern for temporary, fading things, or things that will last. Going back to, remember he says that they'll have to give an account. There's the idea of living for things for which we will have to give an account for to God, versus just completely temporary worldly things. Let's think about some of the things that occupy a lot of stress in suburban America. And again, I'm in this with you. I'm not above this, okay? So these are things that I struggle with, okay? So first of all, let's call it the neighborhood we live in. And that can be like the car we drive, or the clothes we wear, or where we shop, or whatever. But the neighborhood we live in. A lot of times we spend a lot of time obsessing over what neighborhood we live in. We buy a house we shouldn't buy with money we don't have, things we can't afford, so that we can live a certain lifestyle. We make decisions around building the image of that lifestyle. Is God going to judge what neighborhood you live in? Are you going to have to give an account for whether you live in a nice enough area, or drive a nice enough car, or have a nice enough wardrobe? Are you going to give an account for how nice your things are? For how good the labels you can afford are? Absolutely not. God is not going to give preferential treatment for people who live in an up-and-coming neighborhood, drive the new version of the car, whatever. Not going to give an account of that. And yet a lot of us stress a lot over living that kind of lifestyle. But it's completely temporary and unnecessary. All right. Subject number 2. Let's talk about the world of Instagram and Facebook. A lot of people struggle with likes and followers and whatever, comments. We want Instagram and Facebook friends, likes, presence, influence, whatever. We want the filters. We have to make sure that we're looking thin and happy and successful on Facebook. And we compare who has more friends and more likes, and why they liked us, our thing, and or why they didn't like it, and we liked theirs, and they liked theirs, and we didn't. Is God going to ask you on Judgment Day how many Instagram friends, likes, comments, what? No, we know this. We know this, yet how much time do we spend in our Facebook world on our Facebook image, when God is not going to care about that in the least when we stand before Him one day? How about being thin and fit? Now, aside from taking care of our body, which is important, is God going to judge us on our physical appearance? Is our appearance really going to matter that much on Judgment Day? A lot of people get their identity from their appearance and judge others from their appearance. But will that really matter when we stand before God? Again, I'm not talking about our health. I'm talking about our physical appearance and how much stress and time and depression and pain and value people pour into how we look. When at the end of the day, when we stand before God, that's not going to be important. Now let's take another step and talk about parenting. Let's talk about what we are instilling in our kids. And this is scary for me because I have a 13-year-old and a 16-year-old, and the struggle with this stuff is real. Will our kids give an account to God for how much money they make? Will they give an account to God for whether or not they go to a prestigious school, or a community college, or a trade school, or no college? Will they give an account for that? We'll give a silent account, you and I, to our friends when we all compare where our kids are going and what our kids are doing, because you know that we all judge each other and get ideas about how successful we were as parents based on where our kids end up and what our kids end doing. Like there's that silent social account, but that's not before God. That's not before God. We all tend to compare, but not with the standards God does when it comes to parenting. They're not going to give an account for their secondary education to God. How about athletic success? Will they give an account to God for their batting averages, for their athletic accomplishments? Will they give an account to God for whether they made the travel team or played rec ball? Will they give an account to God for the dance squad that they made? Did they play D1? Did they get the lead in the play? Did they give 110% on the field? Did they improve during this season? Will they give an account for that? No. Will they give an account for how generous they are? For how much they cared about people and served others? Absolutely they will. Take the time we spend developing their athletics and extracurriculars and academics compared with the time we spend developing their souls. What's the ratio? See, most of our concerns about our kids, and I'm in this with you, aren't really about what's best for them. We just want them to make us look good. We'll tell them money and success won't make them happy, and we know that's true. But a lot of times we really only push them down those pathways. It's not because God will judge them on their success. It's because other people will think highly of us by their success. Or they may cock an eyebrow at us if they don't have that worldly success. We force our kids to go to the award ceremony so that we can be seen, and so that they can be seen by our friends, so that we look good. I'm in this with you. Look at your life, parenting and beyond. How much energy are you spending on things that God doesn't care about, and things that you will have to give no account for when you stand before Him? How much of your daily stress load surrounds things that God doesn't care about and that you will give no account to Him for? And why do we do that? Why are we so worried about door number 2 and what we might be missing that we forget the things that God has already given us and understand that there are things that are important and things that really aren't all that important? All right, let's talk about how we can improve, because Peter tells us how we can improve some of these things, because I think you'll look at your life and probably realize that you have some struggles in these areas. Okay, so first of all, Peter tells us to look at the example of Jesus. In the ancient world, ancient Christians were obsessed with the example of Jesus, and they looked at His teachings and His example, just mined it for what they could get out of it for their own life. Like, they really believed that Jesus was who they needed to follow, and they tried to mirror His life as they lived out their life. Okay? So Peter says this, and we've already read it. Therefore, since Christ suffered in His body, arm yourselves also with the same attitude, because whoever suffers in the body, is done with sin. So let me make a connection first. In ancient Greek culture, what Peter calls wild living, that we talked about earlier, that was their expression of the same root cause that has us obsessing over materialism or gossiping to gain influence in social groups, okay? They were a little more Vegas-y. Like, for them, It was about wild living, orgies, things in temples that were crazy as means of worship. Like, that was their expression socially. Ours looks a little bit different, but it's the same root cause of trading in who God has made us to try to gain something that we don't have, that we feel that we're missing out on. And so what Peter says here is, look at Jesus, because he was only concerned about the things God had for him. He was only concerned about what he was doing for God. And so he was willing to suffer. He was willing to do without, clear to the point of death, for God's causes and God's will for his life. He was only thinking about his standing with God, and he only cared about things that mattered in his standing with God. That's our example. Jesus wasn't into temporary earthly status. He lived for more. That's what God calls you and me to do as well. And that's who he calls us to be. We have to fly above it. We're no better than anyone, but our wisdom is on a higher level because we get it from Jesus. Now, this is funny. As I'm saying this is all stuff that we would all tell our kids. This is all stuff that we know to be true, and yet it remains a very difficult daily process, and it requires continual evaluation in our life. Let me look at some other things that Peter says for a couple more points of application here. I think it's important that we learn to label bad behavior in our life. Okay, rather than be crushed by it, we label it and we move on. We redirect ourselves and we move on. So we label the bad behavior, we redirect ourselves, and we move on. So, number one, we said, remember the example of Jesus, who lived only for things that mattered to God. So that's our example. But then, secondly, as we deal with ourselves, we need to label the moments when we're out of line. So here's what Peter says. When he talks about pagans, he's talking about people who don't know Jesus the way we know Jesus, okay? He says, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather the will of God. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do. So he says, people who follow Jesus, they do not live the rest of their earthly lives for evil human desires, but rather for the will of God. They've made the switch. For you have spent enough time in the past doing what pagans choose to do, people far from God. So do you see the way Peter understands the past and the present differently? He says, in your old life, you've done those things. In your old life, you've looked behind door number 2. In your old life, you went for immediate gratification. But now you have a new life. And there's a difference. There are people who are far from God who are going to do those things. They're going to do things that you can't do because you said yes to following Jesus. So they're going to get the promotion because they're not ethically driven at work. And maybe their kids are going to get the spot that your kid doesn't get because you won't give your whole life over to the travel sports system or your whole life over to the school function or whatever. There are people who are going to get things that you can't get because they live a certain way. and sometimes we're going to fall into that mode of thinking because we're surrounded by it. But it's important that we label it. That's how people think who are far from God. And I was that, but I'm not that anymore. So you see what I'm saying here? Get in the habit of analyzing your behavior and saying, nope, I used to be like that. I'm not like that anymore. But then it's also, you can say, okay, they're going to do that because they're not following Jesus the way I am. That's their deal. This is my deal. And I can't have it all. So I chose Jesus, and I may not have that, but I'm going to live this way. So you're acknowledging your bad behavior, bad thinking, whatever it is. You're forgiving yourself and you're moving on from it to this new way of life that God has called you to. Finally, Peter gives us the positive to live from. So there's realizing the bad, but he also tells us the good. Here's what he says. This is in verse 7. The end of all things is near. Therefore be alert and of sober mind so that you can pray. Above all, love each other deeply because love covers over a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms. So Peter says we should live like this is all wrapping up. He says the end of all things is near. How would you live if you knew this was all wrapping up? How would you parent if you knew this was all wrapping up soon? Peter says we should focus on loving people, serving them with anything God has given us. He says that's the approach that most exemplifies Jesus and most prepares us to stand before Him someday. So don't get caught up in temporary things. Don't trade your friendship with God and beautiful calling for stupid temporary pursuits. Teach your children the difference between temporary worldly pleasures and success and things that honor God that will last. Love people, serve people, prepare yourself to stand before God because this is all wrapping up soon. I hope you found some things about your identity, some things to work on, some things to weigh out what you stress on versus what's not worth stress, and a path to get better in your friendship with God. Have a good week, everybody.